They laughed when the quiet woman in the faded black coat stepped into the billionaire's mansion that night, but none of them realized they were looking at the future owner of everything inside it. Rain slammed against the towering windows of the Whitmore estate as luxury cars lined the circular driveway one after another, their headlights cutting through the dark like silver knives. Men in tailored suits and women draped in black designer dresses climbed the marble staircase with carefully rehearsed grief painted across their faces. Nathaniel Whitmore, the billionaire real estate tycoon whose empire stretched across half the East Coast, had been dead for only 3 days, and already his family was preparing for war. Inside the mansion, crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished marble floors while servers carried trays of champagne through the crowded hall. The air smelled of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and quiet greed. Everyone had come for the same reason: the inheritance. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the fireplace in a black velvet dress worth more than most people's monthly rent, greeting relatives with cold elegance while her son Damien casually checked stock prices on his phone between conversations. At 38, Damien carried the smug confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing the world belonged to him. Once the papers are signed, the company finally moves into competent hands, he murmured to a cousin, earning several approving nods. Then the massive front doors opened again. A gust of rain-filled wind swept into the mansion as Claire Whitmore quietly stepped inside. Unlike everyone else in the room, she wore no diamonds, no luxury handbag, no polished heels clicking against the floor. Just a simple black wool coat damp from the storm and modest shoes that looked years old. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, her face calm but pale from the cold. For a brief second, conversations softened as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Then came the whispers. Who invited her? I thought she disappeared years ago. She actually showed up? Damien looked up from his drink and smirked the moment he saw her. Well, he said, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Looks like the charity cases are arriving early tonight. A few people chuckled under their breath. Claire ignored them. She quietly removed her gloves and stood near the entrance, as if deciding whether she should stay at all. Eleanor's sharp eyes locked onto her immediately. The older woman crossed the room slowly, her posture stiff with controlled irritation. Claire, she said coolly, barely hiding her disgust. I'm surprised you thought this was appropriate. Claire met her gaze politely. I came to pay my respects. Eleanor's lips tightened. You lost the right to call yourself family a long time ago. The room fell into that particular kind of silence wealthy people mastered so well, the silence where everyone pretended not to stare while listening to every word. Claire lowered her eyes slightly, but her expression never changed. She simply nodded once. I understand. Damien stepped closer, swirling whiskey in his crystal glass. Honestly, he laughed, showing up to a billionaire's while reading dressed like that is bold even for you. More quiet laughter followed. Claire glanced around the mansion slowly, her eyes lingering on the grand staircase, the portraits, the gold-framed paintings Nathaniel once loved. For the first time that evening, something flickered behind her calm expression. Not anger, not shame, something far more dangerous. Memory. And somewhere deep inside the mansion, hidden behind locked oak doors, a black envelope waited silently for the reading to begin. The deeper the night grew inside the Whitmore mansion, the less the gathering resembled a funeral and the more it looked like a silent auction for a dead man's empire. Clusters of relatives circled through the grand hall whispering behind champagne glasses while soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. Who would control Whitmore Holdings now that Nathaniel was gone? Damien leaned comfortably against the marble fireplace, soaking in the attention of distant cousins and business partners who already treated him like the future head of the company. My father built a $70 billion empire, he said confidently. He knew exactly who was capable of protecting it. A silver-haired investor nodded approvingly. Naturally, the board will need strong leadership. Damien smirked slightly. And they will have it. Across the room, Claire sat alone near the rain-streaked windows with untouched tea resting between her hands. Unlike everyone else, she did not mingle or compete for attention. She simply watched the storm outside while thunder rolled faintly above the estate grounds. More than once, servants mistakenly walked past her without offering drinks, assuming she did not belong among the guests. Claire never corrected them. Near the staircase, Eleanor Whitmore quietly addressed attorney Harold Bennett, the family's longtime lawyer. "I trust tonight will proceed efficiently," she said in her calm but icy tone. Harold adjusted his glasses carefully. Nathaniel's instructions were very specific. Eleanor's expression tightened. Specific does not mean complicated. Before Harold could answer, Damien approached holding another drink. "Please tell me we are not delaying this entire evening for her," he muttered while glancing toward Claire. Eleanor lowered her voice. "Your father had strange sympathies near the end of his life." Damien laughed softly. "Sympathy is expensive in this family." Their conversation stopped abruptly when Claire slowly stood from her chair and walked toward an old grand piano sitting beneath the curved staircase. Her fingers lightly brushed the polished wood for just a moment. One elderly housekeeper nearby froze at the sight. "She still remembers," the woman whispered quietly to herself. Claire noticed her and offered a faint smile before stepping away. But Damien had already seen the exchange. "Amazing," he called out sarcastically across the room. "Now she is acting sentimental too." Several guests turned toward Claire again. "You know," Damien continued louder, enjoying the audience now gathering around him, "my father always had a weakness for strays. Employees, assistants, people with nowhere else to go." A few uncomfortable laughs spread through the room. Claire remained perfectly still. "Nathaniel showed kindness to many people," she answered softly. Damien took a sip of whiskey. "Kindness does not put someone in the will." The room quieted instantly. Even the piano music seemed to fade beneath the tension settling through the mansion. Eleanor stepped forward carefully, pretending to calm the situation while secretly feeding it. "Damien," she said smoothly, "there is no need to embarrass anyone tonight." But her eyes never left Claire. The message was clear enough. "You are not one of us." Claire lowered her gaze for a moment, and for the first time all evening, her composure seemed to crack slightly beneath the weight of old memories. 5 years earlier, she had stood in this same hall beside Nathaniel during the company's Christmas gala while cameras flashed and investors applauded his speeches. Back then, the Whitmore family had smiled to her face. Back then, they still needed her. A sharp clap suddenly echoed through the mansion as attorney Harold Bennett stepped into the center of the hall, holding a thick leather folder against his chest. Conversations died immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced solemnly, "the reading of Nathaniel Whitmore's final will and testament will begin in 10 minutes. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward Claire before adding one final sentence that caused a strange chill to pass through the room. "And according to Mr. Whitmore's written instructions, every named heir must remain present until the very end." The Whitmore family followed attorney Harold Bennett into the estate's private library with the tense silence of people pretending to mourn while secretly calculating numbers in their heads. The massive oak doors closed behind them, sealing the room in warm amber light from antique wall sconces and the steady crackling of a fire burning beneath the stone mantel. Shelves lined with leather-bound books towered toward the ceiling, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the dark gardens outside. A long mahogany table stood at the center of the room with 12 chairs arranged around it like a courtroom prepared for judgment. Claire quietly took the farthest seat near the end of the table. No one sat beside her. Damien immediately claimed the chair closest to Harold Bennett, loosening his expensive watch with the confidence of a man who believed the evening already belonged to him. Eleanor remained poised near the head of the table, her hands folded gracefully despite the impatience simmering beneath her calm expression. Other relatives settled into their seats, exchanging subtle glances and quiet whispers about assets, company shares, and vacation properties scattered across Europe and the Caribbean. Harold carefully removed several sealed documents from his leather case before placing them in precise stacks. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "Mr. Whitmore requested that every beneficiary remain respectful throughout these proceedings." Damien smirked faintly. "Respect usually follows money, Harold." A few relatives laughed under their breath. Claire kept her eyes lowered toward the table. Harold ignored the comment and opened the first document. "To my sister Eleanor Whitmore, I leave ownership of the Aspen property along with all attached investments." Eleanor nodded once, already expecting it. "To my nephew Damien Whitmore, I leave my vintage automobile collection and 30% ownership shares in Whitmore Holdings. Damien leaned back with visible satisfaction as murmurs spread around the room. Only 30? One cousin whispered quietly. Damien heard it and smiled anyway. There is more coming. For nearly 20 minutes, the reading continued. Vacation homes, jewelry collections, investment portfolios, art pieces worth millions. Every announcement triggered either relief or disappointment somewhere around the table. Yet one detail slowly became impossible to ignore. Claire's name had not been mentioned once. Damien noticed it too. His confidence grew sharper with every passing minute. Finally, he glanced toward her with open amusement. This must be uncomfortable, he said casually while swirling bourbon in his glass. Claire looked up calmly. What is? Sitting through a fortune you clearly were never meant to touch. Eleanor did not stop him this time. In fact, she quietly observed Claire as if waiting to see whether humiliation would finally push her out of the room. Damien continued, his voice growing louder beneath the heavy silence. My father was generous to people he pitied. Employees, consultants, charity projects. But this, he gestured around the library. This is family business. Claire remained still for several seconds before answering softly. Nathaniel cared about more than money. Damien laughed openly now. That is exactly what people say when they are not getting any. Several relatives smiled awkwardly into their drinks, while others avoided looking directly at Claire altogether. The room carried the cold tension of people enjoying someone else's embarrassment while pretending not to. Then Harold suddenly stopped turning pages. The old attorney adjusted his glasses slowly, his expression harder to read now. Ladies and gentlemen, he said carefully. The remaining instructions involve a separate matter Mr. Whitmore insisted be handled personally. Damien straightened immediately. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Harold reached down beside his chair and lifted a small black envelope sealed with dark wax. The room fell silent the moment it touched the table. Even the fire seemed quieter somehow. Damien frowned. What is that? Harold stared at the envelope for a long moment before speaking. According to Nathaniel Whitmore's written orders, this document could only be opened if Claire Whitmore was physically present in this room tonight. The silence that followed no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt dangerous. For several long seconds, nobody in the library moved. The black envelope rested at the center of the mahogany table like something alive, drawing every eye toward it while rain continued whispering against the mansion windows. Damien was the first to break the silence. What exactly is this supposed to mean? He asked sharply. Harold Bennett kept one hand calmly over the envelope. It means Nathaniel anticipated the possibility that certain matters would require clarification. Eleanor's voice turned colder. Clarification regarding her? She did not even look directly at Claire when she said it. Harold nodded once. Regarding Claire Whitmore. Specifically, a quiet tension spread through the room immediately. Relatives exchanged confused glances while Damien leaned forward in disbelief. There has to be some mistake, he said. Claire has not been part of this family for years. Claire remained seated near the end of the table, her posture composed despite the weight of every stare now fixed on her. The firelight reflected softly across her pale face, while shadows flickered along the library walls behind her. Harold carefully broke the dark wax seal. The sound alone seemed unnaturally loud inside the silent room. He removed several folded pages along with a small silver key attached to a handwritten card. Eleanor's eyes narrowed the moment she saw Nathaniel's handwriting. Read it, Damien demanded impatiently. Harold unfolded the first page slowly. To my family, he began, his voice steady and formal. If this letter is being read tonight, then I suspect many of you are sitting in that room believing you already understand who deserves my legacy. The atmosphere changed instantly. No one interrupted now. Harold continued. For years, I watched people around me mistake loyalty for entitlement and kindness for weakness. Some of you believed wealth made you important. Others believed blood alone guaranteed value. Damien shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Harold looked down at the next paragraph. The one person who never asked me for anything is the same person many of you spent years disrespecting. A hush fell over the library. Slowly, every head turned toward Claire again. Damien let out a dry laugh. This is ridiculous. But his voice no longer carried the same confidence as before. Harold ignored him. 5 years ago, when Whitmore Holdings faced collapse during the federal investigation, every executive, investor, and advisor prepared to abandon the company. Every single one except Claire. Several relatives frowned in confusion. One older uncle whispered, "What investigation?" Eleanor's expression changed for the first time that night. Not shock. Fear. Small and brief, but unmistakable. Claire lowered her eyes quietly. The room suddenly felt smaller around her. Harold continued reading. Claire sacrificed more than anyone in this family will ever understand. She protected this company when doing so destroyed her own reputation. She accepted silence while others rewrote history in their favor. Damien stood abruptly from his chair. Enough. His voice echoed against the tall bookshelves. My father was old and emotional near the end. Whatever guilt he carried does not justify turning this into some kind of performance. Harold slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Sit down, Damien. The authority in the old attorney's voice surprised everyone. Damien hesitated before lowering himself back into his seat. The room had gone completely still now except for the distant storm outside. Harold picked up the small silver key from the table. Mr. Whitmore also instructed me to open a private security box hidden inside his office vault after this letter was read. Eleanor's face drained of color. Harold, she said quietly, that is not necessary. But Harold was already unfolding the final page. One last instruction, he said. Nathaniel requested that before the final inheritance distribution is announced, the family must first hear the truth directly from him. Then Harold reached beneath the table and removed a thin black remote control. Across the library, an enormous television screen hidden behind a framed oil painting slowly flickered to life. Static flickered briefly across the hidden screen before the image sharpened into focus. Nathaniel Whitmore appeared seated behind the desk in his private office, wearing a dark cashmere sweater instead of the expensive tailored suits his family was used to seeing. He looked older in the recording than anyone remembered. Tired. Human. The powerful billionaire whose name controlled skyscrapers, resorts, and investment firms across the country now sat quietly with both hands folded in front of him, staring directly into the camera with solemn eyes. The room inside the library froze completely. Even Damien said nothing. Nathaniel took a slow breath before speaking. If you are watching this, then I am gone. And if my family is gathered together tonight, then I already know exactly what this room feels like. His voice carried through the library with calm certainty. Tension, suspicion, greed disguised as grief. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nathaniel continued. For most of my life, I believed success meant building an empire strong enough to survive anything. But 5 years ago, Whitmore Holdings nearly collapsed overnight. Eleanor's face tightened immediately. Damien glanced toward her, confused by the reaction he noticed for the first time. On the screen, Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly as though revisiting painful memories. Federal investigators opened inquiries into our financial practices after mistakes were made by people I trusted. His tone sharpened slightly at the word trusted. Investors disappeared. Friends vanished. Board members prepared their exits before the market even opened the next morning. The fire crackled softly beneath the growing silence in the library. Nathaniel looked back into the camera. I was prepared to lose everything. The company, my reputation, this family's fortune. Claire sat perfectly still near the end of the table, her fingers gently tightening together in her lap. Then one person stepped forward when everyone else stepped away. Damien frowned. What is this? He muttered under his breath. Nathaniel answered as if he had heard him. Claire Whitmore. The room went completely still again. On the screen, Nathaniel reached for a thin folder resting beside him. What none of you know is that Claire liquidated nearly every personal asset she owned to quietly stabilize Whitmore Holdings during the investigation. Damien blinked in disbelief. Eleanor stared straight ahead without moving. She sold property, investments, and shares held under her own name to prevent thousands of employees from losing their jobs while the rest of you discussed protecting yourselves. One elderly cousin slowly lowered his glass onto the table. Nathaniel's expression softened. Claire asked for no recognition. In fact, she demanded complete silence. She allowed rumors about her to spread because protecting this family mattered more to her than protecting her own image. Claire finally lowered her head slightly, as though the weight of those years had suddenly returned all at once. Nathaniel continued. Some of you called her weak. Others called her manipulative. But the truth is simple. Claire was the only person in this family willing to sacrifice something real. Damien stood again, anger rising across his face. This is insane. Why have we never heard any of this before? Harold Bennett answered quietly without taking his eyes off the screen. Because Claire signed a confidentiality agreement requested by your father personally. Damien stared across the table at Claire now, as if seeing her for the first time. But she still did not defend herself. She simply remained silent beneath the firelight, while the truth slowly dismantled everything the room believed about her. On the screen, Nathaniel leaned slightly closer toward the camera. There is one final thing all of you deserve to know before Harold reads the remainder of my will. His eyes hardened now with unmistakable disappointment. Claire did not stand beside me as an employee. Eleanor suddenly whispered. No, barely audible. Almost fearful. Nathaniel's next words fell into the silent library like thunder. For 12 years, Claire Whitmore was my wife. The words seemed to drain the air from the library. Nobody spoke. Nobody even moved. Rain pressed harder against the tall windows while the fire snapped softly in the silence. But inside the room it felt as though time itself had stopped. Damien stared at the television screen in disbelief before slowly turning toward Claire. That is not possible, he whispered. Claire finally lifted her eyes toward him, calm but tired, as though she had carried this secret alone for far too long. Eleanor remained frozen at the head of the table, one hand gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath the candlelight. On the screen, Nathaniel continued speaking with quiet certainty. 12 years ago, Claire and I married privately in Vermont. We agreed to keep the marriage out of the public eye because my family and business advisors believed a quiet schoolteacher from Ohio would damage the Whitmore image. Several relatives exchanged stunned looks. A younger cousin blinked rapidly. Schoolteacher, he muttered under his breath. Nathaniel nodded slightly in the recording. Claire never wanted attention. In fact, she spent most of our marriage avoiding the spotlight entirely. While all of you chased status, she protected the one thing none of you ever valued correctly. Peace. Claire lowered her eyes again. The memories behind them felt heavier now that they no longer belonged only to her. Nathaniel continued. When the federal investigation threatened the company, Claire offered to divorce me publicly so the scandal would not destroy Whitmore Holdings permanently. Damien shook his head slowly, trying to process the words. No, he whispered again. No, my father would have told us. Harold Bennett quietly replied, your father intended to. But events changed quickly after the investigation ended. Eleanor suddenly stood from her chair. This recording proves nothing, she snapped sharply. The controlled elegance she carried all evening had finally cracked. Nathaniel was sick near the end. Emotional. Vulnerable. Claire looked toward her for the first time in several minutes. He was clear-minded until the final day, she said softly. Her voice was calm, but the certainty inside it silenced the room again. Eleanor stared at her with growing panic hidden beneath anger. You disappeared after the divorce, she fired back. You walked away. Claire held her gaze quietly. Because Nathaniel asked me to. That answer hit harder than shouting ever could have. Even Damien looked unsettled now. On the television screen, Nathaniel reached into his desk drawer and removed a simple silver ring. Claire gave this back to me the day we signed the divorce papers, he said quietly. Not because she stopped loving me, but because she believed protecting my company mattered more than protecting herself. The room remained completely silent except for the storm outside. Nathaniel slowly closed his hand around the ring. Most people spend their lives searching for loyalty while rewarding ambition instead. I made that mistake too. His expression darkened slightly. Some members of this family spent years humiliating the one person who sacrificed the most for all of you. Damien looked down now, unable to fully meet Claire's eyes anymore. The smug certainty that had defined him earlier that evening was gone. In its place sat confusion and something far more uncomfortable. Shame. Nathaniel leaned closer toward the camera one final time. If Claire is sitting in that room tonight, then she honored my last request despite everything she endured in this house. Claire's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. And if my family still sees her as weak, ordinary, or unworthy, Nathaniel continued, then none of you ever truly understood the difference between inheritance and value. The screen went black for several long seconds. No one breathed. Then Harold Bennett slowly opened the final document inside the black envelope while the entire library watched with growing dread. And when the old attorney finally looked up again, his voice had changed completely. Colder. Heavier. Final. There is one remaining matter regarding the full transfer of the Whitmore estate. The silence inside the library no longer felt like grief. It felt like collapse. Harold Bennett stood motionless at the center of the room with the final document resting in his hands while every member of the Whitmore family stared at him as though their future depended on the next sentence leaving his mouth. In truth, it did. The old attorney adjusted his glasses carefully before speaking again. Nathaniel Whitmore amended his final will 11 months ago. Damien immediately stepped forward. Amended what exactly? Harold did not answer him directly. Under the revised terms of the estate, all remaining controlling assets of Whitmore Holdings, including majority voting shares, commercial properties, trust accounts, and international investments, are to be transferred in full to one beneficiary. The room became impossibly still. Nobody even reached for their drinks anymore. Eleanor's face had gone pale beneath the firelight. Damien forced out a tight laugh. Well, obviously that means me. Harold slowly lifted his eyes. No, one word. Quiet. Final. Damien's smile disappeared instantly. Harold continued reading. Nathaniel Whitmore leaves sole executive authority and complete ownership of the Whitmore estate to Claire Whitmore. The room went silent. Truly silent. Not the polite silence of wealthy people pretending restraint, but the heavy, stunned silence that arrives when reality destroys every assumption in the room at once. Somewhere near the fireplace, a crystal glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered softly against the marble floor. Nobody reacted. Damien stared at Harold as though he had stopped understanding the English language entirely. No, he whispered again. That is impossible. Harold calmly turned the document outward toward the table. The transfer was verified and legally sealed by 3 separate firms. Eleanor slowly sank back into her chair. For the first time all evening, she looked old. Claire remained seated at the end of the table exactly as she had been before. No triumphant smile. No satisfaction. No revenge in her expression. Only quiet exhaustion beneath the warm glow of the library lights. Damien suddenly slammed both hands against the table. She manipulated him. His voice cracked with desperation now. This entire thing was planned. Claire finally looked at him directly. If I wanted power, Damien, she said softly, I would have kept it years ago. The words hit harder than anger ever could have. Harold stepped forward again. There is more. Nobody interrupted this time. Nathaniel also instructed that every current board member remain employed under Claire's leadership unless she personally decides otherwise. Several relatives immediately shifted in their seats. Fear spread across faces that had spent the entire night overflowing with arrogance. Harold unfolded one final page. And to Claire, he read quietly, I leave the one thing nobody in this family ever truly earned. My trust. Claire closed her eyes briefly at the sound of Nathaniel's words. Around the room, the atmosphere had completely transformed. Earlier that evening, people had looked at Claire with amusement, pity, and contempt. Now they looked at her carefully, cautiously, like people suddenly realizing the quiet woman they mocked had possessed the power to destroy every one of them all along. Damien stared at her in disbelief. Why did you come here tonight? He asked bitterly. After everything? Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows for a moment before answering. Because Nathaniel asked me to hear the truth with my own ears. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly now. You could have exposed all of us years ago. Claire nodded once. Yes. But you stayed silent. Claire slowly rose from her chair, the simple black coat still draped neatly over her shoulders while billionaires and executives watched her with growing unease. Silence was the only thing holding this family together, she said quietly. Nobody had a response to that. The fire crackled softly beneath the unbearable stillness spreading through the library while Harold Bennett carefully closed the final folder. And for the first time that entire night, the richest people in the room understood exactly how small they truly were. No one left the library after the will was finalized. They simply sat there in stunned silence while the storm outside rolled across the dark estate grounds like distant judgment. The same people who had mocked Claire only an hour earlier now avoided looking directly at her, uncertain how to speak to the woman who suddenly controlled everything their lives depended on. Damien remained standing near the table with both hands pressed against the polished wood, his face pale with disbelief. "You knew," he said quietly toward Claire. "All this time, you knew what my father planned." Claire looked at him calmly. "No, Nathaniel never told me the details." Damien laughed bitterly. "But you still came here." "He asked me to." Her answers remained simple, almost painfully calm, and somehow that made the humiliation inside the room even worse. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair, regaining some of the cold composure she had worn at the beginning of the evening. "Claire," she said carefully, "whatever disagreements existed in the past, we can still handle this as a family." Several relatives immediately nodded in quiet agreement, sensing the shift in power and rushing to adjust themselves. Accordingly, Claire looked around the room slowly. Only minutes earlier, these same faces had watched her humiliation in silence. Some had laughed. Others had looked away. Now every expression carried the same desperate calculation. Harold Bennett quietly gathered the remaining papers while observing the room with tired eyes. He had spent decades managing wealthy families and understood something most of them never learned. Money did not change character. It revealed it. Damien suddenly stepped toward Claire again. "You are really going to sit there and pretend this is normal?" His voice rose slightly with frustration. "You disappear for years, walk back into this house wearing a thrift store coat, and suddenly you own an empire?" Claire finally stood completely, facing him without fear or anger. "I never wanted the empire." Damien shook his head. "Then why did my father trust you more than us?" For the first time that night, Claire hesitated before answering. Not because she lacked the truth, but because the truth was crueler than revenge. "Because I loved him when there was nothing left to gain from him." The room fell silent again. Eleanor looked away first. Claire continued softly. "When the investigation happened, everyone became afraid of losing their lifestyles, their status, their names in magazines. Nathaniel became a problem people wanted to survive." Her eyes moved across the table slowly. "But he was still a human being." Nobody interrupted her now. Even Damien stood motionless beneath the weight of her words. Claire glanced toward the dark television screen where Nathaniel's final image had disappeared moments earlier. He spent the last years of his life surrounded by people fighting to inherit his future while ignoring the man standing in front of them. A hush settled across the library, so deep the sound of rain against the windows suddenly felt enormous. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "Claire, Nathaniel should have told us." Claire nodded once. "Yes, he should have." Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and carefully placed a small silver ring onto the mahogany table. Nathaniel's ring, the same one from the recording. Several people stared at it in silence. "He gave this back to me 2 weeks before he died," Claire said quietly. "He told me wealth had made this family powerful, but not kind." Damien slowly lowered himself into his chair, staring at the ring like it carried every mistake he had ever made. Claire looked at Harold Bennett. "Tomorrow morning, schedule a full meeting with the board." Harold blinked slightly. "At what time?" Claire pulled her coat tighter around herself while thunder rolled faintly outside the mansion. 8 o'clock sharp. Damien looked up in disbelief. "You are actually taking control?" Claire met his eyes calmly. "No, Damien." Her voice remained soft, but every person in the room felt the weight behind it. "I am taking responsibility." And in that moment, everyone finally understood why Nathaniel Whitmore had trusted her with everything. By the time the grandfather clock in the library struck midnight, the Whitmore family no longer looked like people gathered to honor a billionaire. They looked like survivors standing in the ruins of their own illusions. The champagne glasses sat untouched now. The arrogance that once filled the room had disappeared beneath heavy silence and lowered eyes. Claire stood near the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked estate, while lightning flickered faintly across the distant hills beyond the mansion gates. For years, she had avoided this house, avoided the memories hidden inside its marble walls, avoided the painful truth that loving Nathaniel Whitmore had cost her nearly everything except her dignity. And yet somehow, after all the humiliation she endured there, she remained the calmest person in the room. Harold Bennett quietly finished organizing the final estate documents into his leather case before approaching her carefully. "The transfer process will begin at sunrise," he said respectfully. Claire nodded once. "Thank you, Harold." The old attorney hesitated briefly before speaking again. Nathaniel trusted very few people by the end. Claire's eyes lingered on the dark reflection in the rain-covered glass. I know. Across the library, Damien slowly approached her with none of the confidence he carried earlier. That evening, the man who had mocked her code, her silence, and her place in the family now looked like someone struggling to recognize himself. Claire, he said quietly, almost awkwardly, I did not know. She turned toward him calmly. No, she answered softly. You never asked. The words landed with painful honesty. Damien lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. My father talked about legacy every day of my life. I thought he meant power. Claire studied him quietly beneath the warm firelight. Nathaniel spent years building towers, companies, and fortunes, she said. But near the end, he realized legacy is not what you leave behind. It is who still sees your humanity after everything else disappears. Damien looked around the library slowly, at the shattered remains of pride scattered across familiar faces. For the first time in his life, he understood how small wealth could make a person when it became the only thing they valued. Eleanor remained seated near the fireplace, silent and motionless. Earlier that evening, she ruled the room with cold certainty. Now she looked exhausted, staring into the flames as though replaying years of mistakes she could no longer undo. Claire walked toward the table and gently picked up Nathaniel's silver ring. The firelight reflected softly against the worn metal while the room watched her in silence. Nathaniel loved this family, she said quietly, even when this family forgot how to love him back. Nobody argued with her. Nobody could. Claire slipped the ring into her coat pocket before reaching for the black envelope that had changed everything. Tomorrow, she continued, Whitmore Holdings will establish a permanent foundation for employee families affected during the investigation years ago. Several relatives looked up in surprise. Damien blinked. You are giving away part of the inheritance? Claire met his gaze calmly. It was never mine to hoard. A hush fell across the library once more, but this silence felt different now. Not hostile. Reflective. Somewhere deep inside the mansion, the old grandfather clock continued ticking steadily through the night while rain softened outside across the estate grounds. Claire slowly walked toward the massive oak doors of the library, her simple black coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Nobody stopped her this time. Nobody mocked her. As she reached the doorway, she paused briefly without turning around. Money does not reveal who deserves respect, she said softly. It reveals who never deserved power in the first place. Then she stepped into the dark hallway beyond the library while the Whitmore family remained frozen behind her in complete silence. And on that storm-filled night, inside a mansion built on wealth, everyone finally learned the cost of mistaking dignity for weakness.